Welcome to the On the Blue Line podcast. I'm your host, Wayne Mulder, and I'm happy to be here with you another week. We are the second week of February. It's hard to believe it's flying by so fast. Before we get started, don't forget our friends over at Campfire Blend, campfireblend.com. When you use the code BLUELINE, you get 10% off. And they've got great coffee, great small business. So go to campfireblend.com, use the code BLUELINE for 10% off. Let's get this week's podcast started. So I'm so happy that you joined us again this week. This is Morning Roll Call. So if this is your first time listening to us, just know that this is a monologue show. This is my opportunity to just sit down, just you and me, whatever you're doing. Maybe you're out for a jog, maybe you're in the gym, maybe you're walking, maybe you're driving, maybe you're, I don't know, whatever you're doing. Maybe you're sitting in your car. Maybe it's patrol. Maybe it's 3 a.m. and things are going really well. We'll go with well. Yeah, we don't use that Q word. They're going really well, and you have a moment to listen to a podcast. Well, I'm glad that you joined me. This week, just a quick topic for you, something that's been bouncing around in my head. We all know, or have probably heard by now, of the tragedy that took place last Tuesday. Two FBI agents had sustained multiple gunshot wounds, and two were killed, 36-year-old Daniel Alphen and 43-year-old Laura Schwarzenberger. They had gone to serve a warrant at a residence down in South Florida, and they were ambushed. They were trying to serve a warrant on a child pornography case to a 55-year-old Daniel Lee Huber. And Huber had been monitoring the agents through a camera that he had put on his door. So when they came to serve the warrant, he could see them, they could not see him, and he opened fire through the door. It reads, I may have some facts wrong here, but according to the news stories, it appears that he used a rifle and it opened fire through the door. It's a tragic story, and it got me thinking of something I just kind of wanted to mention this week. You know, there's these two words, and any of you who are in law enforcement, you're going to understand this completely, and anyone who's not, you're going to understand it on one level, but it's a whole nother level of the reality of what we do in law enforcement each and every day and what the great officers across this nation do each and every day. It's the words officer down. You know, if I could go my entire career and never hear those words again, I would love it. That would be the greatest thing, to never hear those words again. I've heard them a few times, and most recently about a week ago. And a few things on the term or the words officer down. As you can imagine, it means that pretty much an officer needs assistance. It means something happened. Often it's associated with shootings. That's not the case last week, and it's not always been the case when I've heard those tragic words. But officer down just essentially means that an officer's in a bad way, and they literally are down, and they need people to come to them as quickly as possible to aid them. It can involve a shooting, and oftentimes it can involve them needing to extract that officer out of, maybe it's a hot zone, maybe it's a warm zone, and you need to get them out of that area so that aid can be rendered while you still deal with whatever threat is presenting itself and created the situation in the first place. I started by saying we often think of it in the idea of shootings, and I want to be clear that there's a lot of dangers in this job outside of just shootings. We have a crisis in this country, and it's not the crisis most people are thinking of if they're thinking of the pandemic. Rather, there's the crisis of overdoses, of opioid-related deaths in this country, and the dangers associated with fentanyl and carfentanil and these other opioid derivative products. You know, you get into these products, and officers obviously don't typically have a tolerance level built up for these drugs, and so just a small amount of working around them in whatever that capacity may be. Maybe they're trying to save someone else's life. Maybe they go out to an overdose death and they're trying to, or overdose, not a death yet, go out to an overdose, could ultimately end up in a death. And in either situation, they end up touching things, breathing. I mean, there is limited PPE, personal protective equipment, that officers use. But, you know, it doesn't always solve everything, and it doesn't stop everything. And there's so many factors, much like we're learning with this virus and the kind of the silliness of some of the things that we are doing to combat it, is the fact that you don't always know how these substances work. You know, they can get on something if you don't dispose of the mask, the gloves, whatever properly. You then touch it and so forth. Or maybe there's some ancillary items around that you were not expecting to have the drug on them. And if you touch those, next thing you know, an officer is falling down. And then those words come out, officer down. That's actually what I want to talk about this week. They are the scariest words that you're ever going to hear in this career because you don't know what's happening in that moment. You know, it's kind of like when a radio tones out, which can also be another officer needs assistance or an officer down way of letting everybody know. And, you know, in that moment, it kind of pierces the air. It stops the heart. You just physically or mentally, really, you need to hear more. Anyone that knows anything about comms or police radios or comms in general, I'm sure it's no different in other environments such as the military and first responders. But you can't have multiple people providing traffic across that radio at one time, or you just have confusion. The radio can't keep up. It's all choppy. No one knows what's going on. So the best thing to do is allow those closest to whatever the issue is to speak. So as a supervisor or as another officer, you're not going to typically put out, hey, I need more information, what's going on. You're going to wait for that information to be relayed, because if you're keying up when they're trying to key up, that's the whole idea of 10-3 traffic, is that you can't have all these multiple people keying up at the same time, or you're just going to have mass confusion and nobody's going to know what's going on. So those seconds that you're waiting for more information can seem in and of themselves like a lifetime. Now, I stated there that it's a moment of pause mentally, because at the same time that your heart maybe stops and you're like, what's going on? And you're wanting more information, your body automatically is defaulting to your training. If you're parked somewhere, maybe you're a long ways away, that vehicle is then driving, you're already on your way there. Your mind maybe is trying to catch up, but you're already heading to it. If you're nearby, you're already taking action. If it's a shooting type situation, you're already analyzing for the threat, trying to get them out. You're defaulting, right? That word default. You're defaulting to the level of your training. If it is something that involves maybe an overdose or something like that, an officer falls down, the nearby officers are going to be defaulting to their medical training that they've received as far as dealing with overdoses. Maybe it's administering Narcan, sternum rub, all these different things that you're taught and trained. And so it had me thinking about this from two different points, and these were the ideas I wanted to draw home to you, which is a little bit in accordance with what we're talking about, and it's a little bit of just something that I think we all need to be aware of, right? So when you hear the words officer down, it can be as severe or as tragic as the story that I gave you out of Miami or out of South Florida, where the FBI agents were killed. So let me stop there for a moment. We're in a time where people are scared of death. They're not necessarily scared to death, but they're scared of death. And I'm not saying that that is necessarily wrong. And I get that people don't want to die. I find it interesting that as morbid as it may sound, the only guarantee in life is death. So it seems quite ironic when we have an entire society that is so scared to live out of fear of death. And it kind of, with all of this going on and all of because we've got some issues with COVID and stuff that's hit close to the family. And, we've seen a lot of struggling through this time. And I got this idea, or I was thinking of this idea of legacy. I thought of these two officers going to that front door. They were just going to serve a warrant. They've probably served, I don't even know, at least in the teens, probably many, many more hundreds, depending on what role they have over the years. They went there, and all those times it went just fine. And then this time, it was the last thing they would do in their law enforcement career. And it would be the last thing they'd ever do. And I thought in that moment about this idea of legacy. I thought, legacy is that which survives you. Some people can use the term in a financial standing. Some will use the term in, what you pass on as far as what's important and so forth. And I think that in this time of so much fear of death, that we're forgetting to learn to live, and we're forgetting the why we live, what our role here is. And so often that role is to pass on to others. It's to pass on, again, using that word legacy, something, what we've learned, what we've been given, what we've ascertained to someone else, to our friends, our family, our loved ones. What have we done to influence the lives of others? When when that moment ultimately comes and somebody passes away, and it doesn't really matter. And have no issue with people that accumulate wealth and accumulate. In fact, that's something we all should be doing, and doing our best and starting businesses and capital. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But I've never heard anyone say, man, I wish I would have, earned more money, or I wish I would have worked longer hours at the office, or I wish I would have had one more thing. It always revolves around people, right? It's what they've done in the lives of others. Now, I personally believe these two things are not mutually exclusive. I believe you can make money by oftentimes creating businesses and doing things that make a huge difference in the lives of others. And that is exactly what we all should be striving towards and striving for. But it's this idea of legacy. And I think that it's important to remember that in moments of tragedy, what are we doing now, you and I, while we have this moment alone to talk, what are you and I doing now that's building our legacy? What are we doing in the lives of others? What are we doing in our own lives that's making us a better person, that's radiating around the people around us, that's helping them out? What are you doing? If you can't answer that question, I encourage you to start now. I encourage you to start thinking about it. I encourage you to make this a regular part of life. Because remembering that we will die allows us to live life more fully. As crazy as that sounds, that's why I have such an issue with this whole fear factor and this whole fear around this virus. Because viruses have existed for eons, they will exist for eons, and people are going to die. And I hate to be quite so blunt, but quite frankly, that's what's going to happen. But not everyone's going to die. And if we are so concerned about it and we forget to live, we're losing. We're losing our humanity. We're losing our soul as a people, as a nation. So the first thing I wanted you to think about was legacy. Then the second thing I wanted to bring up on this whole officer down concept that was bouncing around in my head was the idea of what are you doing when that moment comes, when something happens and you need to respond. Like I said, not all officer down calls end in tragedy. Sometimes the officer's just fine. They just needed people to get there to quell whatever the situation was, and they could be rescued and they would be fine. So know your resources in that moment, right? So like I had said, like they say, if whoever they are, but they say you don't rise to the occasion, but you fall to the level of your training. So we, whether you're in law enforcement or outside of law enforcement, should always be training ourselves, right? It's that educational process. And I'm not talking about formal schooling here, though there's nothing wrong with that. I'm talking about learning something. What new skills have you acquired? What things have you done? What if you're a civilian and you drive by an auto accident and there is some situation where you need to take action and help somebody, what skills have you acquired that you can do that? Can you even do basic CPR? What if you're over at a family get together and a kid falls in the pool and you've got to drag that kid out? Can you take action? If your family is out and somebody decides to attack your family or decides to do something to your family, can you protect them? What are you doing in your training to be ready in a moment? Because like I said, when something bad happens or when a moment happens where action has to be taken, you're not going to have time to Google it. You're not going to have time to watch a YouTube video. You're going to go by default. While the brain is still trying to catch up to what's going on, you are already going because that's what you've been trained to do. You know intuitively, this is the action that I'm going to take, whether or not you are, or usually you're not even thinking about it. You're just taking action. So the first thing I want you to do is think about what are you doing in your personal life when it comes to this idea of training and being ready for the unexpected. And then the other idea I want you to think about, and this will be the last one for this week, is knowing your resources, right? There's this statement that's going around in law enforcement. I've heard it locally, but then I've heard it also on a national level as well. But it's okay to not be okay, but it's not okay to stay that way, right? And that's typically applied to the mental health side. You're dealing with these rough cases, these officers that were killed. If something, we've had some tragedies hit close to home. If something like that happens, it's okay to not be okay in that moment. You've got to deal with it. You have to go through the steps of grieving. You have to go through that moment of darkness. But you can't stay there. You have to get back to living, right? That goes back to the earlier point. What's that legacy? What is it that you're hoping to do? What is it that you're passing on? So we have to learn to know what our resources are. And those resources may be internal. They may be your family. They may be things that you personally do. We've talked on here about journaling. We've talked on here about, maybe it's scripture reading, or maybe it's something within your religion. Maybe it's yoga. Maybe it's some sort of meditation. Maybe you subscribe to the Wim Hof breathing method and you do that every day. Whatever it is for you, just know what it is and know your resources. And then I would also encourage you, as part of those resources, relationships. And again, that's something I talk about quite a bit, but you'll find that these situations, they all kind of come back to these core themes, right? Because that's the way life is. We are relational people. And if you know who your relationships are, if you have these friendships, preferably some within the agency, but many of them outside the agency, because you're going to grow when you're around people that they see things in you. They see the changes with the job and so forth. And if you're always around just cops, that's not necessarily good. I'm not saying it's always bad, because I don't subscribe to that theory, but it's not always good. You need to have different perspectives. You need to have people speak into your life in different ways, because it makes such a huge difference. So the takeaways this week: what are you doing to build your legacy? What are you doing to be ready for training, for being ready for the unexpected, for being ready in that moment when you're the one called on to save somebody else's life, and that can be anything. That doesn't have to even be in a law enforcement type setting. Maybe it's a friend that calls you from high school and they're just having a down day. What are you doing to be ready in that moment to step up and to default to your training? What are you doing when it comes to this idea of building relationships? And what are you doing when it comes to knowing your resources? Do you know what resources you have and what resources that you can offer to other people? I hope that's something that you can think about this week. To all my brothers and sisters out there in blue, thank you all for what you do each and every week. It's been another tragic week of seeing multiple officers lose their life in this profession, doing just trying to safeguard their communities and trying to make a difference. And so thank you for what you do each and every day. So with all this tragedy going on, brothers and sisters, please be safe out there. Please, there's strength in each other. There's strength throughout our profession. There's definitely a new battle to fight every day. And I mean that quite literally, it seems like anymore. So please be safe out there. And I hope you enjoy the podcast. We'll see you next Monday at Roll Call. And in the meantime, I'll see you on the Blue Line.